All right, cool. So this is me getting more familiar with restream. So the first 1 minute of this video, I'm going to try and I guess chat myself on either Facebook or YouTube. Let's do YouTube because I believe I found a way that I can use OBS and also monitor the cross-stream chat. There's a lot of good. I feel like I follow a lot of really cool channels, so maybe I will some reactions at some point, but it's not currently really my jam. I follow a lot of really cool channels. So. All right, so I'm looking in this chat, and I'm going to let's see if I can type in my other chat. Yeah, so I typed in my restream chat, and it went over here. Nice. Okay, so so I'm able to use OBS. I also tried out the webcam thing, and it's pretty cool, except that I can't overlay my face on top of my screen share using the live webcam studio for restream, and I think that's kind of important. I might be able to do stuff like that if I do like their paid upgraded version. They have like a lot of cool stuff with the upgrades, including I can live toggle on and off channels, whereas currently I have to, as we found out in my stream yesterday, as soon as I start streaming, I'm immediately live. I don't get a preview phase. Anyway, that's an update on restream. Let's dive into this. Where we were at in part 4, I had just created an adjusted R-square maximizing model. And I wanted to think through the rule breakers effects. So what is rule breakers? There are multiple questions in my survey that ask about non-college graduates with an alternative credential. And basically identifies whether the survey taker considers that person to be a rule breaker, and going a step further, whether they consider being a rule breaker to be good, bad, or neutral. So, as everyone knows, in D&D, you can be a chaotic good or a chaotic bad or neutral. Just kidding, that's not... I mean, that's true, but that's not what this has to do with. But that would be amazing. Okay. So here's one of the questions that feeds into a rule breaker factor. There are 4 rule breaker factors. There are these 3 questions, and then scrolling way down, willingness to break formal or informal rules. There's also this set of 4, which identifies like the person who's making hiring and firing decisions. Do they think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Or, like, for this job specifically that they're hiring, do they demand a certain level of being a rule breaker, willingness to break formal or informal rules? So they signal demand because they respond on a scale of 1 to 10 for the ideal job applicant. So, like, if I tell you, hey, my ideal job applicant is a 10 out of 10, willingness to break rules. What I'm communicating is I would like anyone who applies for my job to have a willingness to break rules. So by describing the ideal type, I'm also describing my demand for certain traits. Then we also see the perceived trait level for a non-college graduate with an alternative credential. We subtract them and take the difference, and that is our skill gap. Is what we're calling a skill gap. And that variable, let's see, this one. So AETIWO is alternatively educated, hold on, compared to, I might want to put like a C. alternatively educated compared to the ideal without overqualification effects. And by the way, that was like I did that wrong. So these variables currently allow for overqualification effects. So two things that I tend to accomplish in this part 5. One is I'm going to create a strong model. So we have the AR2 maximizing model, but it's not a strong model. So we're going to decompose it further. We're going to consolidate factors and get a strong model. What that means is all of the factors individually have a p-value of less than 0.1. I'm not always a fan of strong models. I'm actually generally not a fan of strong models because the 0.1 thing is so arbitrary. I'm usually more friendly to the AR2 maximizing models, and we'll see what I end up using in my paper. I might not even use the strong model, but I wanted to see if rule breaker effects are strong. That's what I wanted to see. So this guy, we see he's at 0.24. And my concern is that if we consolidate to under 0.1, that will get popped out. So that's a concern of mine. And if that is the case, then I probably don't want to use this model because it doesn't communicate the story that I'm trying to communicate in this paper. However, the other thing we noticed is that previously, as I eliminated other factors like the states, there's a bunch of states that fell out. This rule breaker p-value went from like 0.45 to like 0.24, so it decreased. So it could be the case, although I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but it could be the case that further consolidation of this model drives the p-value of that effect down, and it becomes strong. And if that's the case, then the strong model very well may tell the story that I intend to communicate, which is, here's the story that I want to communicate. Hey, skill gaps matter. And we already know they matter just based on the model in front of us. But it could potentially be more convincing to say, not only do they matter, they meet this arbitrary 0.1 threshold. Because even though it's arbitrary, it's a bit of a norm still in science. I'll bring up this article against p-value. Scientists rise up against statistical significance. The reign of the p-value is over, right? And how old are these? Oh, these are from 2019. Actually, the kind of overturning of the 0.05 p-value norm, there's a famous, I don't know if it was the American Psychological Association or one of those A's, APA, AEA. Values under question. Yeah, statement. Yeah. Okay. American Statistical Association. Hey, that's actually more appropriate. The APA is always like saying things, right? But the ASA is like, we are your statistics, bro. So 2016, that feels like the right timeline. So yeah, so why do so many college and grad schools teach P equals 0.05? Because that's what the scientific community and journals and editors use. Yeah, it's when they decompose it in this paper, they just shred it and they make it look ridiculous. But it has been the scientific norm that if you want to prove some correlation exists without doubt, the norm is that you need to prove it with 95% confidence, which is to say you need to prove it at the p less than or equal to 0.05 threshold. That statistically means that you have 95% confidence, holding everything else constant, as in within the actual properly interpreted data set population. So if I sample like from the year 2018, I'm really analyzing a particular population from the year 2018. And if I try and use that same information and forecast into 2023, that's an out-of-sample extrapolation. And it's statistically not correct to say that the correlation still necessarily exists. But if we prove it existed in 2018, prove with 95% confidence, then we kind of do this like magic assumption that it's not going to change. I guess we're giving a stats lesson today, so we'll talk about that. So this is the principle of, like, what is that word? There's a crazy word. Things not changing over time. This is the same reason that we can use carbon dating. Principle of things not changing over time. No, it's not thermodynamic. Uniformitarianism. Yeah, that fucking word right there. Which it's hilarious because it's a this is one of those things that it's like a scientific principle that allows us to do science, but we actually know it's not true. It's like one of the great lies of science, uniformitarianism. And there's some other of these, like naturalism and the physical sciences. I'm really getting the technical words wrong, but there's like science. I think it's just scientific naturalism, right? Which is like, hey, don't talk about religion in your chemistry paper, right? That's not how you do science. However, like religion is a thing, but we don't really talk about it. We don't allow for those sorts of explanations in prototypically scientific papers, which people have criticized that too. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so p-values. 0.05 is like you're being stronger, and you have this old legacy norm that is officially overturned, but unofficially, there's a lot of old scientists that still really like you to prove it, and they are more convinced on a personal level if you can show them at 0.05 or even at the 0.1 level. So 0.05 was like the standard, and 0.1 was kind of like the lax standard. Like, oh, well, there is still an effect. It just might not be the strongest effect, but it would still acknowledge it at 0.1. Me, I'll acknowledge it. I'm much more liberal. I'll acknowledge it all the way up to 0.5, because statistically, the number 0.5 means, if you're less than 0.5, it means it is more likely that there is an effect than it is likely that there is not an effect. And I agree that 0.5 is still an unstable band for factor identification, such that if I identify an effect with a p-value of 0.45, like one or two more samples in my data set could pop that out over 0.5. So I fully acknowledge that getting close to that 0.5 number, you're setting yourself up for like false identification of effects and overfit bias and like a ton of problems. But I also acknowledge that it could be hugely valuable. Like, put yourselves in the shoes of a business owner, and you have something that you're like 50% sure, which is you're not really sure at all. Like, as a scientist, we need to be very confident, right? But as a business owner, you're like, oh, dude, I'm willing to risk it for the biscuit, man. If I can get that money, I have a product idea. I'm 50% sure it'll work. And if it works, I'll make like $1 million. You would still have some willingness to invest like up to like $500,000, right? If you're completely risk neutral, which no one is, but you would still throw down some money. You'd throw down, 10 grand for a 50% shot of making 500 grand, wouldn't you? Okay. And I digress further. So let's strengthen this model. So we've got a strong model, and let's just see. Should be the same thing we just looked at above. R squared 435. I guess that's 436 after rounding. Adjusted 304. And who's the weakest factor? We got a 293. Got a 304. Cool. Let's cut 304. That's state 11. State 25, Gonzo. Three, 2, 6. Hey, you got it popped up. Interesting. 3, 2, 6. What we just saw right there is pretty rare. I don't know if y'all realize that. Rule breakers is ambiguous. Yeah, why didn't you complain about it before? Something weird happened. Let's go back a step. So what we saw was pretty rare, which is everything was stably like we had reached the adjusted R squared, maximum, dude, can I speak English? We had reached the adjusted R-square maximizing model. And I don't know if you remember from the last stream, I actually cut 2 additional factors to prove that it was consistently going down. Okay, so usually you're not going to have a pop over that threshold more than 2 steps later. But we just had a case where we went, this would be the 3rd step because we just cut a couple states, and this would be the 3rd state. And you can see it's over 0.3, which is over our current adjusted R squared, which when I cut this, our R squared should go back up. But will it go back up higher than our established maximum? I don't know. That's the interesting question. It could, in which case our prior claimed adjusted R-square maximizing model is actually just a local maximization, not a global maximization. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so we got these 326 I need to cut. That is state 28. All right, we're at 3031, so it did go up as expected. Do I have any 3s left? That was just a funny goose. One little unstable funny goose, state 28. Let's find out what that state is. Usually I wouldn't waste my time carving through analytics, but for the stream, I'll do it. What is state 28, this funny goose over here? Now remember, the way SurveyMonkey exports state factor numbers, it's not just lining up the states in alphabetical order. That would be 1 through 50, right? What's the last state? Is it Virginia? And then like 50 is Virginia? I don't know. That's not what it is because it only exports for those that were actually responded. What state do you reside in? And you can see there are some states where no one gave an answer. And so like no one said Idaho, no one said Iowa. So I don't actually have samples from these states. Montana. So like my states would only go like 1 through 40, and then also we add in DC. But no one responded DC either. So let's find out. It was 28, wasn't it? So we're going to have to go down here. Here's the answer choices, and we'll skip every 0, and we'll go down 28. 1, 2, 3, 4. And they're index of 1. So programmers like, why didn't you start with 0? The SurveyMonkey exports are index of 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Callie's got 47 samples. So I bet there's a significant effect there. Let's just check. 1, 2, 3, 4. So is state 4 still in the game? No, state 4 got cut. State 4 got cut. So Callie, despite all its samples, after correcting for the other variable data that we have on hand, Callie does not differ in terms of favorability from the population average. Cool. Which is kind of like a, yeah. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's 18 actually. 9, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 25, New York. 6, 7, 8. So the funny goose is Oklahoma. And yeah, I'm surprised it lasted that long with 2 samples. Maybe my counting was off or something. 2 samples. I don't know how you'd find a significant effect, but this was great. Great fun. Okay. So back to the analysis. Seven, 8. 282. I think that's the highest we got this round. Is state 39. And this round robin factor hardening. What was our, oh, I should have recorded the global. Okay, rule breaker looks like it's on the cutting block, huh? Okay, rule breaker is on the cutting block. Let's rerun that maximizing model and get the AR2. So now we're at 303. It was at 3036. And whenever we hit the part where we popped up and went back up, it went to 3031. So we actually never popped up high enough to supersede this 3036. So it is truly, at least according to this round robin factor consolidation technique, which I'm not sure, but I think it's kind of like a thing that I just did myself. It's like a systematic factor hardening that I haven't seen other people do. And I don't know why. The academic factor hardening that I see seems to be really ad hoc. They'll be like relying on theory instead of like what's the data in front of you. And unfortunately, you see the analyst preferences color that theory application like all the time. I'm like, can we have an objective process? Like, so that's why I do the p-value round robin factor hardening. Okay. So this is really an arbitrary model where it's stronger than the factors that survive this long are stronger than our maximizing model. But the model overall is not really better than the maximizing model. We pretty much we haven't actually cut any questions. I would not have to administer any fewer questions to a survey taker to identify this model compared to the maximizing model. We cut factors, like we cut duration 6 or something. Maybe it was, duration 3 or 6. We cut a duration factor, but we did not cut the whole duration question. So I would still have to ask them how long they think it takes to get an alternative credential. That's the duration question. Okay? And this is where, by the way, I don't want to get on another tangent, but this is where AR2's penalty, per factor penalty, is highly criticizable, because what it tries to do is it tries to reward simplicity. But if you're cutting factors and you're not actually cutting your survey implementation so that your survey is equally complex and costly to implement, from a cost perspective in a business application, I haven't actually simplified anything. I haven't actually simplified or reduced cost. So it's not a cheaper, more efficient, it's not information efficient. It's only from a statistical point of view where the pure statistics doesn't know how many questions it took unless you create your own construct, which I did, and I call it Q complexity. And this is like a completely different paper, but I'll just mention it. And I also have something called V complexity. So, and so you could argue that, hey, my adjusted R squared went down, but which is bad theoretically, but my Q complexity went down, which is actually like really good. So Q complexity is the number of questions you have to ask to identify the model. And also, if your adjusted R squared went up, but your Q complexity didn't change, then in practice, in a typical application, you probably didn't realize any cost savings or analytical savings. There's only this like very small margin of abstract complexity information science that you actually simplified things, because, for example, you eliminated potential interaction vectors between duration 3 and all the other factors. So like there's no way that if duration 3 is unimportant, it limits the ability to interact in the model. So from an information science standpoint, you kind of simplified some things because you eliminated you eliminated complexity there. But that's like a theoretical improvement, and it's not really a practical improvement, because at the end of the day, I still have to pay for this survey with 10 questions just because I'm ignoring the answer on like they chose B and I don't really care. But I still have to ask the question, so I still have to pay for that response to that question. It's still costly. Cool. Another good tangent. I hope that was worth something. So yeah, in this paper, Alt Ed COVID Grit Ocean. If you want to go check this bad boy out, this file, old OLS, replicate old OLS, it's actually copied from a older analysis. So let's see if I can get that older analysis. So Alt Ed scraping, ooh, F complexity. So F complexity is the number of factors, and that is what is used in adjusted R squared. It's like the number of degrees of freedom. It's like the number of factors. So here you can say, my F complexity went from 51 to 30. So I eliminated like over 20 factors, but my Q complexity didn't change. So is it really that much of a simpler model? So this is like stuff that you would really care about in an applied context that like the journals don't really care. They're like, what are you doing making up your own Q complexity? Unless my paper is going to be about that, which they could potentially find interesting. So I'm not currently writing in like pure statistical journals because they're hardcore over there. And it's also like not my degree focus. But when I'm done with my dissertation, I do plan to circle back. And I have a few things to say to the actual stats papers themselves. One would be around Q complexity, and one would be around horse racing. Maybe I have two things to say. Maybe that's it. I don't know if we would consider it a separate thing, but the round robin process, I don't know if we separate that from horse racing, so maybe I have three things to say, or maybe that's just part of the horse racing. All for another day. I wonder, oh yeah, I was going to create this interaction. So body language still survived, right? Yep. So let's generate interaction. I use _X for my interactions. IT industry, which one was that? One, two, three, four, five, six. Industry 6. Industry 6 survived, and it's pretty important, which is intuitive. The IT industry approaches alternative credentials, and I would say they're more positive, right? Yeah. So the IT industry, like coding boot camps and certifications and stuff like that, we value those, I think, more than other industries. And in fact, if you look, there is no other industry with more significant effect. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so, oh, that's a manager effect. So 1, 2, 3. So there's a few. There's a few industries with a larger magnitude of effect, but there's no other industry with as reliable an effect. Which is cool. What is industry 1? Let's take a look. I'm not sure. Agriculture. That's so weird, man. That's so weird. There's only 2 responses here. I feel like if I ran a chi-squared, it would fall out. Chi-squared, like, cares about your sample density for a particular intersection of responses. And like 2 responses here It's just really shaky, basically. Okay. Industry 6. So let's generate that variable. I have no idea why it's complaining about this. It's like too long, maybe? Oh, I guess it's too long. Okay. So I will leave that as a comment. And I will really just call this body XIT. Looks like I can still get my underscore X's in there. So I'll call it this. Okay. So body language times IT industry is industry 6, I believe. Cool. All right, so we'll generate this guy. And then we will add this in. So this is a reanalysis. So in a pure reanalysis, I would add this to the very top, the kitchen sink regression way up here, and I would start the whole process over again. I think I mentioned this before. I've actually had other like peer reviewers criticize me for that, and they just said like you're testing everything and you're going to be overfit basically. So I'm going to start the reanalysis from a MaxAR2 model. It's just less arbitrary. It's like so theoretically it could lead to less overfit. Honestly, I don't think it like helps the problem much, but at least this way I can go, oh, like they told me to do it. So don't argue with me, argue with them. So it's got something there. Okay. Okay. So let's go through these steps again. Wow. Hold on. So if I don't include it, because now rule breaker is immediately on the chopping block. So if I don't include it, that's weird that it partials sideways from rule breaker. Okay, so yeah, state effects are weaker if I don't include it. But now if I do include it, so the interaction matters because the interaction is stronger than our rule breaker effect. But we're not actually sure if the rule breaker effect matters. Here's an interesting point, though. It didn't partial body language. Didn't partial out body language. Body language is still independently important from the interaction, and they could be attenuating each other, but that's fine because they are independently important. How about industry 6? Industry 6, you can see the p-value increased, so it partialed out some, but they're really still independently important because even though the p-value increased, it's still like way under 0.1. It's under 0.01, so it's still highly significant in its own right. Now rule breaker doesn't matter. All right, so let's take out these 3, and I expect the rule breaker skill gap to increase. So let's just test that. Nope. Nope. So when I took out the other rule breaker measures, the existing rule breaker measure became totally irrelevant, which means it's probably an artifact of overfit. So probably this factor doesn't matter. I mean, I guess that's kind of obvious, right? Here it is with a 999. Let me just regress it on its own. And let's just make sure that like by itself, it's like insignificant. So, see, it's close. It's close. But it is insignificant. It's close to 0.5. No normal scientist would say this is close. A normal scientist would be like 0.5, 5. Crazy town. Totally doesn't matter. So yeah. I think hiding under this, I think this high p-value could be explained as an aggregation of lower level things that matter. And do we have a good measure here for those lower level things? So the rule breaker gap, let's delete the gap. So now what we're going to say is that the rule breaking gap doesn't matter. It purely matters. Yeah, this was interesting because we said, what if we just have the rule breaker gap and we don't have the interviewer's perception of rule breakers? If all we have is the rule breaker gap and we don't know, I think I should actually write this in the paper. It's an important enough result. If all we have is the rule breaker gap and we don't know the interviewer's perception, the rule breaker gap totally doesn't matter. It's a 999. Totally doesn't matter. But what if we only know the interviewer? So I'm at an interview. There's the interviewer. I'm the interviewee. I don't know what he thinks about me, but I know what he thinks about alternative credentials in general. How much does that matter? That's what this guy's going to tell us right now. Boop. The answer is hella. It hella matters. It hella matters. So the skill gap comparing the alternatively educated non-college graduate, comparing that guy to an ideal, the difference in willingness to break rules doesn't matter. What matters is the person conducting the interview, making the hiring and firing decision. What do they think being a rule breaker means? It doesn't, yeah, and that's intuitive now that I think it out loud. So it doesn't matter if you're a rule breaker. It matters. I feel like that's not even quite fair to say. It doesn't only matter if you're a rule breaker. You're a rule breaker, so what? What does that mean to me? So in theory, I should need both. In theory, I should need both. When we have both, let's go back to the situation where we have both. Where we have both, it does matter, actually. It does matter. But then I created a body language IT interaction variable, which is the weirdest thing that it would partial out sideways from that. So basically what I'm saying is that situation I described does matter. I can tell if you're a rule breaker, and we know what I think about rule breakers. But apparently, if we also know what I think about your ability to read body language, that somehow attenuates the effect to such a degree that we're still under 0.5, but like basically not. By the way, did the sign flip? So here rule breaker is negative, and before the introduction, rule breaker is also negative. Okay, so at least it was sign robust, which is good. That's like a signal of robustness. But we still have a problem in our hands because 495, people are not going to acknowledge 495. Hey, what happened to the adjusted R squared when I introduced the generated variable? 3078. So actually, this adds to the weight of the importance of the interaction, because it didn't just have its own p-value by itself. Because here's what I could say. I could say, hey, I increased the p-value over here, but I popped up the p-value over there. So now the model overall, is it stronger or weaker? It's not clear. This AR2 answers that for us. It says the model overall is stronger. The model overall is stronger. Okay, I wonder if it interacts with the IT industry. How did I even come up with that hypothesis? Oh yeah, because like I just reflected on the fact that like I work with geeks, and the prototypical geek like doesn't get body language. And an alternatively educated person who doesn't follow norms jives with the prototypical geek. So they could be a better programmer, but they might be worse in other industries where that's not the ideal. I don't even know if it's an ideal. I think it's just a norm or an expectation. Like I don't think anyone would say the ideal programmer lacks social skills. That's not right. It's more like the stereotypical programmer lacks social skills. It's more of an expectation than an ideal. Anyway. So reanalysis from max AR2. Max AR increased. So let me just take my preferences out of the picture. This is so funny, right? When you do this, sometimes it makes it so much easier. My preference is to tell a story where they both matter. And like, let's just take my preference out of it. According to normal science, I would cut this guy. Again, I hesitate because it's less than 0.5. But like normal scientists would say, okay, you identified, it's more likely there's an effect than not an effect, but your strength of that statement is so weak, it's almost laughable. Or it is laughable. I think most scientists would laugh at me. If most scientists are going to laugh at you, maybe you're doing something wrong. That's a good rule of science. Let's cut it. Okay, rule breaker, goodbye. So the rule breaker gap, what we're doing here by cutting this factor structurally, what we're doing is we're saying the rule breaker gap doesn't matter. What matters is the interviewer. What do they think breaking rules means? Now, why would the rule breaker gap not matter? Oh, and it's also a negative coefficient. So the difference here, I do ideal minus. Okay, so the fact that it's a negative coefficient, so it's ideal minus actual. So if it's negative, the actual is greater than the ideal, which means that the actual, like those who have alternative credentials are expected to be rule breakers. They are overqualified in the area of rule breaking. They are more likely to break rules compared to an ideal. They're overqualified in the area of rule breaking. That is what we expect. Oh gosh, I'm getting sent pictures of donuts. Response, do it. So this is actually like what most scientists think is already true. So whenever you're trying to get a journal article published, there's different tensions, what you should include and what you should exclude. So based purely on the p-value here, I'd want to exclude it because it feels like a weak result, and anything that is pinned to this is highly criticizable. However, it's also a coefficient that's consistent with what scientists already think. So for that reason, you might want to include it, even if you're like, hey guys, don't put any stock in this estimate, but like check the sign. The sign is what you thought. So you can have a little more confidence in what I'm about to say. So how much weight does that point carry? So a lot of the scientists that I know, social scientists, think that those people who get alternative credentials are rule breakers, almost by definition, right? So the normal thing to do is to immediately roll in college after you're done with high school. That's the normal thing to do. So to say, hold on, I'm going to go get an alternative credential and become a non-college graduate with alternative credential is by construction an abnormal situation. So the idea is that those people who break rules, in fact, those people who break norms, in fact, have a propensity to break those norms. So at some level, it's at least correlated to an actual preference, a personal level preference, or a lack of inhibition, at least. And that these people are in part what the college degree is signaling against. So signaling theory of education says that by getting a college degree, it's not so much that you got skills in college, it's that you're sending a signal of who you are. And one of those things is that you're like normal. So that the non-college degree graduate is not normal. And being overqualified in the willingness to break rules, specifically norms, less so legal rules, but like social norms, is consistent with that prior held by many academics. So if you're consistent with a prior held by many academics, this might make the peer reviewer more favorable to what you're saying. One thing that I've done in the past that I might do here, which is to say, hey, this effect is insignificant, but if we read it out, the sign is consistent with what we expect anyway. I think I might go that route. So that technically I've eliminated this factor, but I might bring it in at the end just to tell a story. So let's see if it does that. I think I'll do that if I can keep it under 0.5. So B, insert to strong model in order to tell a story, even though this effect is weak. Okay? And when we get there, I just might not do it in the final paper. But this is a way that I can move on right now because I'm really stuck on it right now, to be honest with you, because I want to keep it. But the stats say I shouldn't. But and I'll tell you this, in economics anyway, a lot of times people would say structural models are better. Almost like everyone would say, structural models and theory-based models are preferred to models built on p-value optimization. Almost everyone would say that. And the reason I'm hesitating so strongly is because eliminating this guy is actually not just a matter of statistical optimization. It's a matter of like structural change and theoretical change. It's like removing a factor that I think matters. Because think about it the other way. Let's say I only have these three. What I know is what the interviewer thinks about those people with those rule breakers. Why would that possibly matter unless they know whether the candidate is a rule breaker? So it seems to be like a basket deal, if you will. And I think this is only so high because these guys. Let me try maintaining only one of these guys. All right, so that's still significant, and this still popped up. What if I switch to one of the others? What I'm doing right now is really shady because I'm basically trying to look for the single factor that gives me the result I want. So I will not be doing this in the paper because it's bad, but I'm just curious. So is it the case that regardless of which I pick, they all tell me the same thing? Yeah, so regardless of which I pick, they all, and it's negative the whole time, right? So it's negative in every case. Even yeah, it's negative in every case. The fact that the sign is so robust is really telling me that we have a robust sign. We just have no confidence whatsoever in the coefficient, is the vibe that I'm getting. Okay, so I'll proceed, but I'll proceed with vibe. Checking the stream. Nobody says anything? What, y'all can't talk? Talking shit to your audience is probably not the way to get more. But I don't know why I said but. It's not the way to get more viewers. Okay. So reanalysis from max AR with the interaction. What's my interaction variable name? Okay. With interaction inserted, max AR increased, and now with tiers, I admit rule breaker skill gap has popped. Okay. P over 0.45, wasn't it? Okay, let's go back to the yeah, okay, 4.9 over 4.9. I think I'll say equals. Approximately equals 495. This data always rounds. So all these numbers you see, they're all rounded. So I hesitate to say anything equals anything. But I'll say it approximately equals. Plus, in statistics and pure statistics, your confidence in any particular point value should always be 0. You can only have confidence in a range. It's like set theory. So by saying approximately equal, I'm implying some range. So I can actually have confidence in a point estimate. Okay. So we pop rule breaker, and what I wanted to mention here and so what this really does is this implies that whether there are rule breaker is embedded in the other factors. Okay. Okay, because the effect was partialed out. Because the rule breaker skill gap was partialed out, this implies the effect is embedded / captured in other factors, particularly in the. It would seem to say particularly in the new interaction, but that's really weird. I'll put a question mark there. That's really weird because what that's implying is that an interaction between body language and the IT industry replaces the need to identify rule breakers. And actually, it really doesn't because the effect is still there. It's just hella weak, right? So is embedded captured in part. Okay, so the rule breaker sign is robust to like various specifications. It's just hella weak. Now, this one way I could treat this problem would just be to gather more samples. It could be the case that if I gather more samples, in fact, I think that's probably, like very probably the case, that if I just like double my sample size, this p-value would decrease. Might need to go get donuts. Okay, 9.5. Right, so we're gonna have to cut it. So we will cut it and then we will reinsert it after identifying the strong model to further prove the sign robustness. Check is sign negative as theoretically expected and as presented in basically every specification among this analysis. Okay, so we're gonna cut it. Like I'm just gonna keep crying and I'm gonna cut it. Okay. Rule breaker. Goodbye, rule breaker. Apparently, it doesn't matter that you're a rule breaker, even though it does. I take more comfort in saying basically the other factors imply whether you're a rule breaker. Okay, we can actually test that. So we'll create EQ special 1, which is going to check, do other factors imply rule breaker skill gap? This will make me feel so much better if I get a result here. So we're going to take all these factors except favorability, and we are going to reassign the dependent variable to be the skill breaker gap. Did I say skill breaker? I meant rule breaker. So can we predict whether you're a rule breaker? I want to see like a r squared over 0.2. And I want to see a couple factors that have a p-value under 0.1. And the higher the r squared and the more significant factors, I feel even better. Oh, I included rule breaker on the right hand. Whoops. Okay, so I got an r squared over 0.2. And I bet in the adjust r squared is close to 0.1, but I bet after I clean up the variables, I'll probably have an AR2 close to 0.25, which feels good. That feels good. And I got company size matters. Ooh, does it now? That's kind of interesting, isn't it? The company size matters so much. That's kind of interesting. Okay. The state matters. Okay, fair enough. A couple states matter. Most of them don't, but a couple do. And the body language thing. So apparently your ability to judge body language, maybe I shouldn't act so surprised. Maybe this is intuitive in a way and I'm just kind of missing it. Yeah, so look, body language as well as the new interaction variable are insanely predictive of rule breaker. So if we think about rule breaker in terms of compliance with social norms, the fact that you're like oblivious to body language, maybe it's not that you have a willingness to break social norms, it's just that you're oblivious of social norms. I think that's the insight we're gleaning from this. Wow, that's really interesting. Okay. Confirmed that other factors, particularly body language and minor effects from state and company size. Confirm that other factors, particularly body language and minor effects from state and company size, explain, which is to say they partial out, and maybe like co-explain. Is that a weird word? I'll just say explain / co-explain / partial. Do they partial in or do they partial out? They partial out. They partial out because the p-value increased, meaning it was an unexplanatory variable after the partialing happened. Okay, so they explain / co-explain / partial out. Confirm that other factors. Okay, the rule breaker skill gap. Okay, this seems to indicate. This seems to indicate an insightful gap. The indication is that the skill gap is not a willingness to break legal, social norms and rules, etc., but is simply a social obliviousness to such things. And I would say if that's the case, EQ should autocorrelate as well. So do we have EQ in here? So I think we dropped EQ earlier, but I'm going to insert EQ, and we will see if it has a significant effect. I don't want to be too stringent and say it has to be under 0.1 necessarily, but I would like to see under 0.4, and the lower the better. Really, if it's 0.39, I'm going to be like, no. If it's 0.39, I'll still call it a win, but I'd really like to see it lower than that. Okay, so let's say EQ. Reinsert EQ gap to check this interpretation. Okay, so we will copy that, and then we will add the EQ factor. Boop. 328. What's up, baby? It's like I know how to do science or something. Wow, the science is so real. That makes me really happy. 328, I'm calling that a win. If it was like 0.6, I'd be like, I think I'm missing something. Like, I think it did this all wrong. But the fact that it's 328, and did that increase the AR2? So we are 129. It actually decreased the AR2, but I don't care because I'm pretty damn confident that this is just a sampling effect. Is the reason the P is that high. I think I think the sample quantity is too low, and that if we increase the number. So these are all hypotheses we could test, right? But I consider this confirmatory. And let's look at the sign as well. So the sign is if you have a larger EQ gap, and let's remember on average the gap is on average the EQ gap is that people have less EQ than desired. On average, the gap is that people have less EQ than desired, so the alternatively credentialed non-college graduate is expected to have lower and lower and lower EQ as the gap grows. It's not like we think the ideal is getting higher and higher and higher. Like pretty much everyone is going to say ideal EQ is high. So it's going to be high. The only thing that's moving lower and lower is like how much EQ do people actually have. And we can go back and do the summary statistics again, but in the stream 1, I went over the summary statistics. Or I guess it was part 4, sorry, the previous stream. So, in other words, there's a positive gap where the alternatively credentialed person is not overqualified, they are underqualified. It's an underqualification gap. It's not a sign agnostic gap. It's an underqualification gap in aggregate. And a significant, and like a huge one. It's like, whoa, these people have no EQ. So what we're saying is that big underqualification is going to result in a less gap of a rule breaker. Let's think about that. In a less gap of a rule breaker. It doesn't mean you're going to be less of a rule breaker. It's going to be your rule breakiness is well matched to ideal. This is actually hard for me to think through right now. Your rule breakiness is matched to ideal if you don't have EQ. I have no idea why that would be. That seems strange, doesn't it? I think I might just be missing it. Your rule breakiness matched to ideal. Okay, maybe. This is only a maybe. I'm not really confident. I think probably I'm missing the point here. But it might be the case that if your EQ is really high, then you automatically have a really low tendency to break rules. You don't want to break like social rules. Like you don't want to break rules because your EQ is so high and you're like reading the room and like acting optimally according to what everyone says. And you know the norms and you follow them. So high EQ is basically being a norms follower. So with this line of thought, the only difference is that being a norms follower is not ideal. That would be the only result there. Let's double check the summary statistics. Is that the case? I feel like I remember that was the case, that for some reason ideal rule breaking was higher than expected. So now we're back in SurveyMonkey. These are just the top line results without correction. Willingness to break. Okay, 6.4 ideal. Typical. So the typical employee is not willing enough to break rules. College graduate, not willing enough to break rules. Those with alternative credentials are willing to break rules at a near ideal level, at essentially the ideal level, according to, yeah. So the gap goes away. So a big gap in EQ is associated with, we can't say this is causal, but from a process standpoint, there's some reason to speculate that it's causal. But we would need additional research to confirm that. So it basically looks like if you have low EQ, then you break rules at the ideal level, which is to say slightly more often than the typical actual employee. So in the corporate world, there is a hunger for rule breaking. I love it. I love it. Okay, so skill, so EQ factor P under 0.33. I'm calling that a win, although it could use more samples. And also sign is in the expected direction. This is one of those really interesting results, in my opinion, that is probably not going to be in the paper because it would be considered too much of a tangent for the paper. But it makes me more confident in like, what is it when your like conscience is clear? It makes me like feel like I'm doing the right thing, basically, because it supports what I'm saying, even though it's like this really complicated rabbit trail that supports what I'm saying. Okay. I don't know if we can say the sign is in the expected direction. Negative coefficient on EQ indicates that low EQ persons tend to low EQ persons resulting in large positive EQ skill gap. Low EQ persons tend to break rules near the ideal level, which is to say more than recent college grads or typical actual employees. I do this indent when I'm like continuing the same sentence. So negative coefficient on EQ indicates that low EQ persons tend to break rules near the ideal level. This is consistent with the obliviousness as rule breakers as social skill oblivious, not malicious theory. Okay, so they're not breaking rules because they're aware of them and they're like, fuck these rules. It's more just like they're just like, what rule? This is consistent with so they have low EQ. They don't even know what the rules are. So if you want to be successful, you should have low EQ. No, that's not what this is saying at all. Everyone knows you should have high EQ. Okay. Great tangent. Makes me feel good about what I'm saying. Did we cut rule breaker over here? 495, let's cut rule breaker. Goodbye, rule breaker. Hello, all-time high adjusted R squared. 3-1. All-time high, baby. Okay. Okay, is there anything else we should cut? I didn't see any 3s. We can try cutting some of the 2s, but here's a 2, 6, 7. 2, 9, 3. State 28. Seven, 7. Yep. Okay. Duration 3. Seven, 7. 5. So now we're going for the strong model, by the way, right? I feel pretty much across the bridge that we have the 3-1 is the best AR2 we're going to get. State 12. Is state 12. Is state 12. And here comes our interaction getting weak. So we might have gone through all that only to cut it much. That happens. So that implies we might have converged on the same model without ever reinserting the interaction. It's fine. Interaction effects are, by their nature, secondary effects. So they're usually, they often don't make it to the strong stage. Here's a 2. State 16. Okay. And I think I can tell my strong factor story. I think I can still tell that. Oh, look at this. And I can just say that the whether you're a rule breaker is basically embedded. I don't know if I like the embedded approach. I might go with the. I'll have to think about it. We got 204. Technical job skills falling out. Yeah, see, I feel like we're getting to the point where we're cutting things that we know are important. If an applicant has a huge gap in their technical skills, this should influence your favorability to that applicant. And it should reflect badly on however you think they were trained, whether traditionally or non-traditionally. So to cut this, we're cutting things that definitely matter at this point. So I can't go with the strong factor model. But at least this way we'll be able to say which factors matter the most. And it appears like the body language thing is ahead. Oh no, conscientiousness. And we already know independently that conscientiousness matters. I have a paper on that too. Personality effects. So let's cut the job skills, whatever. State 37. State 6. Oh, I thought. Was that Cali? Or was that state 4? Oh. Now industries are popping. So I think that might have been Cali that we just unleashed a bunch of unexplained samples now. Industry 4. Okay. Industry 11. Two. Industrial effects are basically all falling out now. 1. 10. Cool, so it looks like industrial effects completely fell out at long last. And we know industrial effects matter for how people feel about credentials. So this strong model is an over-optimization. We're cutting too much. Size 4. Company size really matters. Wow, look at this. And the company size 8, those are like super big. Apparently super big companies are favorable, which is really great because these are exactly the companies that have the economies of scale to support lower skilled workers. Train them internally, raise them up. So it's a nice natural harmony. It's like a nice Evidence that the economy is working, frankly. All right, so we're going to finally cut this guy, right? So I got 175. Yep. Company size 8. State 6. So state effects really matter strongly, apparently. A nice secondary analysis would dive into these states and say, oh, these states, what's so special about them? Probably find some cool policies. Or duration 5. So we might see duration collapsing altogether now. Yep, so duration finally collapses. 106, 107. There goes body language. There goes body language. State 26. All right, so here's your strong model. I hope you like it. It's terrible. Adjusted R squared 0.23 as opposed to 0.31. So that's a reduction of almost 30%, right? Yeah. So imagine being able to forecast 30% worse. And you're like, but hey, I'm really, really confident in all of my inputs to the forecast. It's ridiculous, man. Your forecast is 30% worse. Like, it really depends what you're trying to do with a model. If you're trying to have the correct coefficient value, we need to strengthen the model and get that high and get that low p-value with high confidence. But if you're just trying to give the best, most accurate forecast, going for a strong model is probably not the way to do it. Now, we did lower the effective cost of implementing this model because we cut whole, not just factors, but like whole variables, like duration, like whole questions on a survey. So I don't have to ask so many questions here. I need to ask, are you a manager? What state are you from? And a couple gaps, and then these 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I need to ask 7 questions here. The original survey was like 60 questions, right? And literally, there's cost per question in some of these surveys. So if you're trying to have the cheapest model possible, if you're really, really sensitive to the model cost, then a strong model is probably the way to go. But if you're not so sensitive to the model cost, and if you're like, if administering a survey is relatively cheap compared to the value of your forecast accuracy, which I think that's the case in many cases, then an adjusted R-squared maximizing model is probably going to be better, or even what I call a weak model, which we haven't talked about the weak model, but the weak model is not an adjusted R-squared maximizing model. It's when all of your p-values are under 0.5, so you think probably every individual factor matters, but you're just not really confident. So it's like really casting a wide net. That's the weak model. Sometimes your forecast can be better using that model, but it does tend to have like a higher false positive rate. Okay, so the R squared here is 716. AR2 is 276. Okay. And I think I'm going to call that a day for now. Thanks for joining. We'll see if I do another one. This has been fun.